The morning mist clung to the pine-covered hills of Aldermere like a shroud, masking the horror that was about to unfold. Kedrick Volante stood on his cabin's porch, steam rising from his coffee mug as he watched the sunrise paint the mountain peaks gold. At 42, he had chosen this remote community precisely for its isolation from the chaos of the modern world. The irony of that choice would soon become devastatingly clear. 3 miles down the winding mountain road, Serafina Thorne was already at work in the small medical clinic that served their community of 200 souls. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun as she inventoried supplies, humming softly to herself. She had moved to Aldermere 5 years ago after losing her husband in a car accident, seeking peace among the evergreens and the simple, honest people who called this place home. The radio crackled in the background, playing old country songs that reminded her of better times. The tranquility shattered at 7:43 a.m. when the emergency broadcast system interrupted the music. Serafina's hands stilled on a bottle of antibiotics as the mechanical voice delivered news that seemed impossible: reports of violent attacks in major cities, victims displaying aggressive behavior and apparent immunity to pain, government officials urging citizens to remain indoors and avoid contact with affected individuals. Across town, Zephyr Blackwood was teaching his 15-year-old daughter Nyx how to properly clean and maintain their hunting rifles when his satellite phone began buzzing with urgent messages from his former military contacts. His weathered face, marked by years of service in special operations, grew increasingly grim as he read each text. The final message from his old commander contained just 4 words that made his blood run cold: "It's real. Prepare now." Stellan Cross, the community's unofficial patriarch at 78, was tending to his vegetable garden when young Iona Silvermere came running up the path, her 3-year-old son Malachi clutched tightly in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she gasped out fragments of what she had heard on the radio. Stellan set down his watering can and placed gentle hands on her shoulders, his pale blue eyes reflecting decades of wisdom and the sudden weight of terrible understanding. The first sign that their mountain sanctuary was no longer safe came at noon. Cassius Nightfall, a solitary man who lived in a cabin near the community's southern border, stumbled into the town center covered in blood that wasn't his own. His usually pristine black clothing was torn and stained, and his hands shook as he tried to speak. The words that finally emerged painted a picture of unimaginable horror: hikers from the valley below, moving in ways that defied nature, their eyes vacant but their hunger all too real. Kedrick found himself thrust into a leadership role he had never wanted as panicked families gathered in the community center. The large log building, which had hosted countless celebrations and meetings, now buzzed with fearful voices and crying children. He looked around at faces he had known for years, people who had shared meals and stories, who had become his chosen family in this mountain refuge. The weight of their trust settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Serafina arrived with her medical bag, her professional composure intact despite the tremor in her voice as she examined Cassius's wounds. They were bite marks, she confirmed quietly to Kedrick, deep and savage but already showing signs of infection that didn't match any pathogen in her experience. Zephyr and Nyx brought their weapons and tactical knowledge, while Stellan's calm presence helped organize the chaos into something resembling order. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the community of Aldermere faced a truth that would have seemed like fiction just hours before. The world they had known was ending, and their only hope lay in each other. The bonds forged through years of shared isolation would now be tested by an enemy that defied comprehension, and the quiet mountain town would become the stage for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but their very humanity. Outside, the first shadows of evening began to gather, and somewhere in the distance, an unnatural howl echoed through the pines. The howl that pierced the evening air sent chills through every soul in Aldermere's community center. Kedrick moved to the windows, his eyes scanning the darkening treeline as conversations fell to anxious whispers. The sound had been wrong somehow, carrying a hunger that spoke to primitive fears buried deep in human DNA. He felt the collective shiver that ran through the room and knew that their time for preparation was running shorter than anyone wanted to admit. Zephyr was already in tactical mode, his military training overriding the shock that had gripped others. He spread a detailed topographical map across one of the long tables, his calloused finger tracing the natural barriers and potential escape routes that surrounded their community. Nick stood beside him, her young face set with determination that belied her 15 years. She had inherited her father's steady nerves and quick thinking, traits that would prove invaluable in the days ahead. Together, they began marking defensive positions and calculating sight lines with the methodical precision of people who understood that planning might be the difference between life and death. Serafina had transformed a corner of the center into a makeshift medical station, laying out supplies with careful efficiency. Her hands moved with practiced confidence as she sorted bandages, medications, and surgical instruments, but her mind raced with questions that had no good answers. How did one treat bite wounds from something that shouldn't exist? What antibiotics could fight an infection that seemed to spread with supernatural speed? She caught Stellan watching her work and saw in his ancient eyes an understanding that transcended medical training. The old man had lived through enough to recognize when the world shifted on its axis. He had seen war, plague, and natural disasters, but this felt different. This felt like an ending. Yet even as that grim realization settled in his bones, he moved among the frightened families with quiet words of comfort and gentle touches that reminded them they were not alone. His presence became an anchor for those who felt themselves drowning in fear. Iona sat in a corner with Malachi sleeping in her lap, her fingers stroking his dark hair as she hummed a lullaby that her grandmother had sung to her. The melody was older than memory, a song that had comforted children through countless dark nights throughout history. She had lost her husband in a construction accident 2 years ago, and this community had become her lifeline. Now she faced the possibility of losing everything again, but she would not let terror take her son's mother from him. As the evening deepened, Cassius provided more details about what he had witnessed. His voice remained steady, but those who listened carefully could hear the tremor beneath his words. The hikers had moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their bodies seeming to ignore injuries that should have been crippling. When he had tried to help what he thought was an injured woman, she had turned on him with teeth bared and nails extended like claws. Only his quick reflexes and knowledge of the mountain trails had allowed him to escape. The community's radio operator, a quiet woman named Thessaly Moonwhisper, had been monitoring emergency frequencies since the first broadcasts. The reports coming in painted a picture of civilization crumbling with terrifying speed. Major cities were under martial law, communication networks were failing, and rescue services were overwhelmed. Most disturbing of all were the gaps in transmission, whole regions that had simply gone silent as if they had been swallowed by the growing darkness. Kedrick gathered the adults for a planning session while the children were settled with activities designed to keep them calm and occupied. The discussion that followed was brutally honest about their situation. They were isolated, which had protected them so far, but it also meant they were on their own. No help would be coming from outside, and their survival depended entirely on their ability to work together and make difficult choices. The debate over whether to flee or fortify was intense but brief. Zephyr's reconnaissance of possible escape routes revealed that the main roads were likely compromised, and attempting to move through the wilderness with children and elderly community members would be almost certainly fatal. Stellan's knowledge of the mountain's geography confirmed that Aldermere's position, while remote, offered natural defensive advantages that could be leveraged with proper planning. As the meeting progressed, assignments began to take shape. Zephyr would coordinate defenses and train anyone capable of handling weapons. Serafina would establish medical protocols and identify community members with relevant skills. Stellan would organize supplies and manage the psychological well-being of the group. Iona and other parents would be responsible for keeping the children safe and maintaining some semblance of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal world. The decisions made that night would echo through the trials ahead, binding the community together with shared purpose and mutual dependence. They were no longer just neighbors living in proximity, they had become a tribe united by necessity and forged by the recognition that their individual fates were now inseparably intertwined. Outside, the mountain night had settled in earnest, and the unnatural sounds were growing closer. Dawn broke gray and cold over Aldermere, the pale light revealing a community transformed overnight. Where once peaceful cabins had dotted the mountainside, now stood the skeleton of a fortress born from desperation and determination. Kedrick stood atop the community center's roof, surveying the barricades that had taken shape through the night's frantic work. Tree trunks, overturned vehicles, and salvaged materials formed defensive lines that would have been unthinkable just days before. The sight filled him with both pride and a deep sadness for the innocents they had been forced to abandon. Zephyr moved through the fortifications like a general inspecting his troops, his critical eye noting weaknesses and strengths with equal measure. Nyx shadowed his steps, absorbing lessons in tactical thinking that no 15-year-old should need to learn. They had identified 3 primary defensive perimeters, an outer ring designed to slow and channel any approaching threats, a middle barrier that could be held by a small force, and an inner redoubt around the community center where non-combatants could shelter. Each position had been carefully chosen to maximize fields of fire while providing escape routes if the lines were overwhelmed. The transformation extended beyond mere physical defenses. Seraphina had worked through the night to establish medical protocols that accounted for their new reality. The clinic had been moved to the community center's basement, which offered both protection and easy access to those who might need emergency care. She had also identified 17 community members with medical training ranging from veterinary medicine to combat first aid, creating a network of care that could function even if she herself was incapacitated. Stellan had become the heart of their psychological fortress, moving constantly among the workers and families to provide encouragement and maintain morale. His weathered hands helped wherever they were needed, whether securing a barricade or comforting a frightened child. He understood that their physical defenses were only as strong as their collective will to use them, and that will depended on maintaining hope in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. The work progressed with an efficiency born of shared purpose. Families who had known each other casually for years discovered hidden depths in their neighbors. Thessaly Moonwhisper proved to have an engineer's mind for problem-solving, designing ingenious warning systems using the community's amateur radio equipment. A quiet carpenter named Orion Darkwater emerged as a master of improvised fortification, turning everyday materials into formidable barriers with nothing more than basic tools and creative thinking. Iona had organized the children into work crews appropriate to their ages, giving them tasks that made them feel useful while keeping them away from the more dangerous construction. Malachi and the other youngest ones gathered stones for filling gaps in barriers, while older children served as runners carrying messages and supplies between work sites. The activity helped prevent the corrosive effects of helpless waiting, though Iona never let herself forget that she was preparing children for war. Cassius had proven invaluable as a scout, his intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden paths allowing him to move unseen through the surrounding wilderness. His reports throughout the day painted an increasingly grim picture of their isolation. The roads leading to Aldermere showed signs of recent passage, but not by any vehicles they recognized. Disturbed earth, scattered belongings, and dark stains on the asphalt told stories that no one wanted to fully imagine. As the afternoon wore on, the community's radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions from other survivors. A group trapped in a school gymnasium in Colorado pleaded for rescue that would never come. A family farm in Montana reported successful defense against multiple attacks before their signal went abruptly silent. Each transmission served as both inspiration and warning, reminders of what they were fighting for and what waited for them if they failed. The most chilling report came from a National Guard unit that had been attempting to reach isolated communities in their region. Their final transmission, received as evening approached, spoke of roads blocked by abandoned vehicles and evidence of coordinated attacks that suggested their enemies possessed more intelligence than anyone had hoped. The implications hung unspoken in the air. They were not simply facing mindless predators, but something that could plan and adapt. Zephyr gathered his impromptu defense force as the sun set behind the western peaks. 12 adults and 3 teenagers who had shown aptitude with weapons stood in a rough circle, their faces reflecting the weight of responsibility they had never asked for. He spoke to them not as soldiers, which most had never been, but as protectors of everything they held dear. His words were simple and direct, focusing on practical tactics rather than grand speeches, but they carried the conviction of a man who had faced darkness before and emerged victorious. The final preparations were completed as full darkness fell. Sentries took their positions at listening posts scattered around the perimeter, equipped with radios and signal flares that would alert the community to approaching danger. Emergency supplies were distributed to family shelters, and weapons were cleaned and loaded with the methodical care of people who knew their lives might depend on mechanical reliability. As Kedrick made his final rounds before settling into his own watch position, he reflected on how quickly their small paradise had become a war zone. Yet looking at the faces around him, he saw not defeat but determination. They had built more than barricades in the past day, they had forged themselves into something stronger than the sum of their individual parts. Tomorrow would test that strength, but tonight they stood ready. In the distance, something howled its hunger to the stars. The attack came with the mist, silent and swift as death itself. Kedrick was pulling the midnight watch when movement caught his eye near the outer perimeter, shapes that moved wrong against the natural flow of mountain wildlife. His hand found the radio at his belt, thumb hovering over the transmit button as he strained to make sense of what he was seeing through the pale moonlight. The figures stumbled forward with the jerky, unnatural gait that Cassius had described, but there were more of them than anyone had imagined possible. The alarm that shattered the mountain silence was not the electronic screech they had planned, but Zephyr's voice cutting through the radio static with military precision. Contact. Outer perimeter. Multiple hostiles approaching from the south. This is not a drill. His words galvanized the community into action with a speed that surprised even those who had drilled for this moment. Lights flickered on in shelters, weapons were checked, and families moved to their assigned positions with the fluid coordination of a well-rehearsed dance. Serafina was already moving toward her medical station when the first gunshots echoed through the valley. The sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated by Nyx's precise voice calling out target positions over the radio painted an audio picture of the battle unfolding in the darkness beyond the buildings. Her hands moved automatically through final preparations, laying out surgical instruments and checking blood supplies while her mind tried to calculate how many wounded they might face if the outer defenses were breached. The first line held longer than anyone had dared hope. Zephyr's careful positioning of his defenders in concealed positions along the tree line allowed them to engage the attackers while remaining largely invisible themselves. The creatures that shambled toward Aldermere showed no fear of gunfire, pressing forward even when bullets tore through their bodies in ways that would have dropped any living thing. It was Nyx who made the crucial observation that would change their entire defensive strategy. "Dad, headshots. Only headshots are stopping them." Stellan found himself coordinating the defense of the inner perimeter, his calm voice on the radio becoming an anchor for defenders whose nerves were fraying under the pressure of their first real engagement. He had seen war before, but this was different. These enemies felt no pain, showed no fear, and seemed driven by a hunger that transcended any human motivation. Yet his steady presence helped maintain discipline among defenders who might otherwise have broken under the psychological pressure of facing something that should not exist. Iona crouched in the basement shelter with Malachi and 8 other children, her arms wrapped protectively around her son as the sounds of battle filtered down through the floor above. She sang softly, the same ancient lullaby that had comforted generations of frightened children, while her eyes never left the emergency exit that might become their only hope if the unthinkable happened. The other parents in the shelter drew strength from her apparent calm, not knowing that her composure was held together by nothing more than sheer determination to be strong for her child. The breakthrough came at the western barricade, where a section of hastily constructed barriers gave way under pressure from a larger group of attackers than the scouts had detected. Cassius's voice crackled over the radio with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Secondary contacts. North and east. We're being flanked." The revelation that their enemies possessed enough intelligence to coordinate a multi-pronged assault changed everything about their tactical situation. Zephyr made the decision to fall back to the second perimeter, a choice that came with terrible cost. Orion Darkwater and 2 other defenders were cut off during the withdrawal, their final radio transmissions speaking of ammunition running low and positions being overrun. Their sacrifice bought precious time for the rest of the community to reorganize, but the loss of 3 good people in the first engagement cast a shadow over what might otherwise have been considered a successful defense. The second phase of the battle was fought in the shadows between buildings, a deadly game of cat and mouse where every corner might hide death and every sound could mean the difference between life and annihilation. Thessaly Moonwhisper had rigged the community center with a network of motion sensors connected to her radio equipment, providing real-time information about enemy positions that proved invaluable in coordinating defensive fire. It was during this phase that they discovered their enemy's most terrifying characteristic. A defender named Lyrian Stormcrest, who had been bitten during the fighting at the western barricade, began showing signs of infection within minutes of the wound. Serafina worked frantically to treat what she initially thought was shock, but the rapid deterioration of his condition forced a horrifying realization. When Lyrian rose from the medical table with vacant eyes and snapping teeth, it was Stellan who made the hardest decision of his long life. The battle raged until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight seemed to trigger a retreat among their attackers. The creatures that had pressed their assault with relentless determination suddenly began withdrawing toward the deeper forest, leaving behind scattered bodies and the lingering stench of corruption. The defenders watched in exhausted amazement as their enemies simply melted away with the mist, as if daylight itself was anathema to their existence. The cost of victory was etched in the faces of the survivors. 4 dead, 3 missing, and 1 mercy killing that would haunt Stellan's dreams for whatever time remained to him. Yet they had held their ground, learned their enemies' weaknesses, and proven to themselves that survival was possible. As Kedrick surveyed the damage and began planning for repairs and improvements, he knew that this had been only the beginning. The real test would come when their enemies returned with greater numbers and hard-won knowledge of Aldermere's defenses. 3 days after the first attack, Aldermere bore the scars of a community under siege. The cheerful flower gardens that had once lined the walkways lay trampled beneath hastily constructed firing positions, and the windows of every building were now reinforced with whatever materials could be found. Kedrick stood in what had once been the town square, now transformed into a tactical command center where maps marked with enemy movements covered every available surface. The transformation from peaceful mountain retreat to military installation was complete, but the human cost was beginning to tell. Serafina moved through her patients with the methodical care of someone who knew that medical supplies were finite and replacements would never come. Her makeshift hospital in the community center's basement had grown to accommodate not just physical wounds, but the psychological trauma that was eating away at their defenders' effectiveness. Sleep deprivation, combat stress, and the constant threat of infection from any contact with their enemies had created a secondary epidemic that threatened their ability to maintain effective resistance. The most challenging case was Thessaly Moonwhisper, whose network of electronic surveillance had become their early warning system but who had not slept more than an hour at a time since the attacks began. Her eyes had developed a haunted quality as she monitored radio frequencies that brought increasingly desperate messages from other survivor groups. Each transmission that ended in screams or static added another weight to her growing burden of helpless knowledge about the world beyond their mountain sanctuary. Zephyr's defense force had been reorganized around the harsh lessons learned in combat. The original 12 adults had been reduced to 8 through casualties and the discovery that not everyone could function effectively under the psychological pressure of killing things that had once been human. Those who remained had developed into a tight-knit unit whose coordination in battle was bought with the currency of shared trauma and mutual dependence. Nyx had aged years and days, her teenage concerns replaced by the responsibilities of someone who had proven herself capable under fire. She moved through the community with the careful alertness of a veteran, checking weapons and ammunition supplies with an attention to detail that would have impressed her father's old military instructors. Yet Kedrick sometimes caught glimpses of the child she had been in moments when she thought no one was watching, and those glimpses broke his heart. The psychological toll was perhaps heaviest on Iona, who struggled to maintain normalcy for Malachi while preparing for the possibility that she might need to make unthinkable choices to protect him. She had begun teaching him to hide in spaces too small for adult pursuit and to remain silent even when terrified, lessons that no 3-year-old should need to learn. The weight of that necessity was visible in the new lines around her eyes and the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. Stellan had become the community's confessor and counselor, the repository for fears and doubts that couldn't be shared in group settings. His tent served as an informal sanctuary where defenders could speak honestly about their growing despair without undermining overall morale. He listened to admissions of fear, accounts of nightmares, and confessions of doubt about their ability to survive with the patience of someone who understood that the human spirit needed tending as much as their physical defenses. Cassius continued his dangerous work as their eyes beyond the perimeter, but his reports painted an increasingly grim picture of their tactical situation. The enemy forces were growing, drawn by some unknown signal or instinct that brought scattered groups together into larger formations. More disturbing was evidence that they were learning from their previous encounter, approaching the community's defenses from different angles and testing for weaknesses with what seemed like deliberate intelligence. The second major attack came on a moonless night when the darkness was so complete that even their night vision equipment struggled to provide adequate coverage. This time their enemies approached with coordination that suggested not just intelligence but genuine tactical thinking. While the main force engaged the southern defenses in what appeared to be a frontal assault, smaller groups infiltrated from multiple directions, probing for gaps in their perimeter with methodical precision. The battle was a nightmare of confused fighting in absolute darkness, where friend and foe were distinguished only by passwords and prearranged signals. Emergency flares cast hellish shadows that moved and danced in ways that played tricks on exhausted minds, and the sound of combat echoed strangely off the mountain walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was during this engagement that they lost their first child, young Marcus Holloway, who had been serving as a runner when a breach in the eastern perimeter allowed 3 attackers to reach the community center. Serafina's medical training had not prepared her for the sight of what infection could do to a child's body. The speed of the transformation was horrifying, Marcus's small frame convulsing as something alien rewrote his basic biology with ruthless efficiency. It was Iona who had to make the decision that Serafina could not, her maternal instincts overriding every other consideration as she protected not just her own son but the memory of the boy Marcus had been. The aftermath of the second battle brought a crisis of morale that threatened to destroy them more effectively than any external attack. The defenders who remained were exhausted beyond the point where rest could restore them, and several families began discussing the possibility of attempting escape despite the almost certain death that waited on the mountain trails. It was in this moment of deepest despair that Stellan revealed the secret he had been carrying since the attacks began. In his youth, before settling in Aldermere, he had worked for a government program that studied biological warfare and infectious disease containment. The outbreak they were facing matched theoretical models he had helped develop decades earlier, scenarios that had been considered too dangerous to exist outside of classified documents. His knowledge suggested that their enemy's apparent intelligence was not evolution but design, and that somewhere beyond their mountain sanctuary, forces existed that might be capable of stopping the spread if they could be reached. The revelation transformed their struggle from a hopeless defense into a mission with purpose beyond mere survival. They were no longer just protecting themselves but preserving knowledge that might prove crucial to humanity's eventual victory. Yet with that hope came a new burden, the realization that their sacrifice would need to be perfect, that allowing even one infected individual to escape into the wider world could doom countless others. As dawn broke over their battered community, the survivors faced a choice that would define not just their own fate but the meaning of their resistance against the darkness that was consuming the world. The morning of the 7th day dawned blood-red through smoke that rose from fires burning in the valley below. Kedrick stood atop the community center's roof, binoculars in hand, surveying a landscape that had been transformed into something from humanity's darkest nightmares. What had once been scattered groups of enemies had coalesced into a horde that stretched from the treeline to the river, a mass of corrupted humanity that moved with unified purpose toward their mountain sanctuary. The sight was both terrifying and oddly beautiful, like watching a living tide of darkness flow uphill against all natural law. Stellan's revelation about the biological nature of their enemy had changed everything about their defensive strategy. They were no longer fighting for time or hoping for rescue that would never come. Instead, they had become the guardians of knowledge that might prove crucial to humanity's survival, protectors of information that could not be allowed to die with them. The weight of that responsibility transformed their desperate defense into something approaching a sacred duty. Zephyr moved through his final preparations with the calm efficiency of a man who had accepted that this day would likely be his last. The remaining defenders, now numbering only 6 adults and 2 teenagers capable of combat, had been positioned to maximize the damage they could inflict while protecting the community's most vulnerable members. Every weapon had been cleaned and loaded, every position prepared with overlapping fields of fire, and emergency protocols established for scenarios too terrible to discuss in detail. Serafina had transformed the basement medical station into something resembling a field hospital, though she harbored no illusions about her ability to treat the wounded if their defenses were overwhelmed. Instead, she had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing a different kind of medicine, quick-acting compounds that would ensure a peaceful death for those who could not be saved from infection. The decision to prepare such measures had been the hardest of her life, but the memory of Marcus Holloway's transformation made the choice inevitable. Nyx checked her rifle for the dozenth time that morning, her young hands steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. She had positioned herself in the bell tower that topped the community center, a location that provided excellent sight lines but no escape route once the building was breached. Her father had argued against the assignment, but they both knew that her marksmanship might be the difference between success and failure in the critical opening moments of the battle. Iona sat with Malachi in the deepest part of the basement shelter, surrounded by emergency supplies and the emergency radio that would carry Stellan's vital information to other survivors if their defenses failed. She had rehearsed the transmission protocols until she could operate the equipment in complete darkness, understanding that her role as the community's final guardian might require her to make an ultimate sacrifice while ensuring that their knowledge survived. The attack began at noon with a sound like thunder rolling across the mountainside. The unified advance of hundreds of infected individuals created a vibration that could be felt through the ground itself, a drumbeat of footsteps that seemed to synchronize with the defenders' racing heartbeats. Unlike their previous encounters, this assault came with no attempt at stealth or tactical subtlety. Their enemies had simply gathered in overwhelming numbers and chosen to crush Aldermere through sheer force. Cassius fired the first shot from his position at the outer perimeter, his rifle's crack echoing across the valley like a starting gun for the final race. The defenders had agreed to fight a withdrawing action, making the enemy pay for every yard of ground while conserving ammunition for the final stand at the community center. Each defensive position had been prepared with improvised explosives and obstacles designed to channel the attacking horde into predetermined killing zones. The first perimeter fell within minutes, overwhelmed by numbers that made accurate counting impossible. Cassius and Orion Darkwada's nephew, a teenager named Phoenix Emberstone who had volunteered for the suicidal outer defense, managed to fall back to the second line with wounds that spoke of desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Their retreat marked the beginning of a running battle that would test every skill they had learned in their previous encounters. Thessaly Moonwhisper's electronic surveillance network provided crucial intelligence during the fighting, tracking enemy movements and coordinating defensive fire until her equipment was destroyed by the shockwave from an explosion that claimed the eastern barricade. Her final transmission, delivered in a voice steady despite mortal wounds, provided targeting information that allowed Nyx to eliminate a cluster of enemies who had broken through toward the community center's main entrance. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming numbers proved almost as challenging as the physical battle itself. Defenders who had shown courage in previous engagements found themselves struggling against primitive terror as wave after wave of attackers pressed forward without regard for casualties. It was Stellan's voice on the radio, calm and reassuring despite the chaos, that held the defense together during the critical moments when panic might have broken their coordination. Zephyr's careful planning paid dividends as the battle progressed, his prepared positions and overlapping fields of fire extracting a terrible toll from the attacking horde. Yet even the most successful defensive action could only delay the inevitable when facing such numerical superiority. By mid-afternoon, the defense had contracted to the community center itself, with enemies pressing against every entrance while the few remaining defenders fought from prepared positions inside the building. The end came not with the dramatic breach of their defenses but with the quieter recognition that ammunition was running low and several defenders had sustained wounds that made continued resistance impossible. In the basement shelter, Iona began her final radio transmission, broadcasting Stellan's biological data on emergency frequencies while Malachi played quietly with toys that might be the last he would ever touch. As evening approached and their situation became untenable, the defenders gathered for what they knew would be their final counsel. The choices they faced were limited and none were easy, but their commitment to preventing the spread of infection beyond their mountain sanctuary remained absolute. They had become something more than a community under siege. They had become humanity's final guardians in this small corner of a dying world. The transmission began at twilight, Iona's voice carrying across emergency frequencies with crystalline clarity despite the chaos surrounding her. Stellan sat beside her in the basement shelter, his ancient hands guiding her through the complex biological data that might someday unlock the secret of their enemy's nature. Above them, the sounds of battle had faded to an ominous quiet broken only by the scraping of claws against wood and the low moans of hunger that would never be satisfied. Malachi dozed in his mother's lap, exhausted by days of fear and upheaval, his small hand clutching a toy airplane that his father had carved from mountain pine. Iona's fingers combed through his dark hair as she spoke into the radio microphone, her voice never wavering despite the tears that flowed silently down her cheeks. She was broadcasting not just scientific data but the story of their community's last stand, ensuring that their sacrifice would be remembered by whoever might survive to receive the transmission. Upstairs, Kedrick made his final rounds through the community center, checking on the defenders who remained at their posts despite wounds that should have been incapacitating. Zephyr sat propped against a barricaded window, his rifle aimed at shadows that moved with patient hunger just beyond his field of fire. Blood seeped through makeshift bandages, but his hands remained steady and his eyes alert. When he met Kedrick's gaze, something passed between them that needed no words, a recognition of duty fulfilled and brotherhood forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances. Nyx remained in her bell tower position, though ammunition for her rifle had been exhausted hours ago. Instead, she served as the community's eyes, reporting enemy movements with the same precision she had shown throughout their defense. Her radio calls had taken on an almost poetic quality, describing the movements of death itself with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too much to remain shocked by horror. Serafina had administered her final doses of pain medication, using the last of her supplies to ensure that those who would not survive their wounds could face the end with dignity. Her medical bag sat empty beside her as she held the hand of Thessaly Moonwhisper, whose electronic genius had served them so well. Together they listened to radio static that might have been other survivors or might have been nothing more than the echo of a dead world's last gasps. The breakthrough came near midnight, when accumulated damage to their barricades finally allowed their enemies to surge into the community center's main floor. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but the outcome had been inevitable since the first overwhelming assault began 12 hours earlier. One by one, their voices fell silent on the radio network that had coordinated their resistance, each loss marked by Stellan's quiet prayers for souls who had given everything to protect something larger than themselves. Cassius was the last defender to fall, his position at the basement stairs bought with ammunition hoarded for this final moment. His sacrifice gave Iona the time she needed to complete her transmission, broadcasting the complete biological profile of their enemy along with tactical information that might help other communities survive similar attacks. As his ammunition ran out and footsteps began descending toward their final refuge, she made the choice that had haunted her nightmares since the attacks began. The emergency charges that Zephyr had placed throughout the building detonated simultaneously, triggered by a dead man's switch that ensured their enemies would find nothing useful among the ruins. The explosion lit the mountain night like a falling star, visible for miles in every direction as a beacon that announced both an ending and a beginning. In settlements scattered across the dying world, survivors would see that light and know that somewhere, people had chosen to stand and fight rather than submit to the darkness. When dawn broke over Aldermere, only silence remained where a community had once thrived. The infected horde had moved on, drawn by instincts toward other settlements where human warmth still beckoned. The mountain wind scattered ashes across slopes where children had once played and families had gathered for celebrations that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Yet the silence was not complete. Hidden in a cave system that Cassius had prepared as an emergency shelter, a cache of supplies waited alongside copies of Stellan's research and recordings of Iona's final transmission. The hiding place had been prepared for children who might survive the adult's last stand, though in the end it served a different purpose as a time capsule preserving the story of people who had chosen sacrifice over surrender. Months later, when the first recovery teams finally reached the remote mountain valley, they would find evidence of a battle fought with tactical skill and strategic wisdom that suggested military training among the defenders. The biological samples and research data hidden in Cassius's cave would prove instrumental in developing treatments that turned the tide of humanity's war against extinction. But perhaps the most important discovery was a child's toy airplane, carved from mountain pine and found among the ruins of the community center. The simple wooden toy became a symbol of innocence protected and hope preserved, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, there had been those willing to stand guard over the future with nothing more than courage and love for what they could not bear to lose. The mountain remembers, as mountains always do, and in the wind that sighs through the pines there are echoes of voices that chose defiance over despair, sacrifice over survival, and love over the fear that seeks to consume all light from the world. Their names were spoken once in ceremonies honoring the communities that held the line, but their true memorial exists in every child born afterward into a world where darkness did not triumph. In the end, Aldermare's greatest victory was not the enemy forces they destroyed but the hope they preserved, passed forward like a torch through the long night of humanity's testing to kindle fires that burn still in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender to despair.